Hello, space friends. Captain Snuggles here, back in X4 Foundations to bring you the new, improved, bigger, and better version of my high attention cost effectiveness test. I've tested this twice before, in 7.1 and Beta 7.5. Now that we're in 8.0, I want to see if anything has changed with the recent updates, and I also want my results to be both broader and more detailed, which, in retrospect, was disrespectful to my time and my sanity, but here we are. I'm using a more robust experimental protocol, and I'm also testing more ship classes, more combinations of ship classes, and a wider variety of loadouts. The goal is to collect and analyze data that will help you craft better fleets and better plans, both with and against AI-controlled ships. Now, let's talk specifics. I'm testing the cost-effectiveness of different ship classes in AI-controlled fleets in high-attention, ship-to-ship combat against the Xenon. Cost-effectiveness because it's the only meaningful measure of effectiveness in an economy simulator. AI control because every ship in the game except one is controlled by the AI. Fleets because they're a unique and useful feature in X4. High attention combat because it's faster and much more fun to look at than the alternative, and ship-to-ship combat for the same reason. And the Xenon because they're a common and predictable enemy, which makes them the best performance metric for experiments like this. Here's my specific experimental question. How does the AI's high-attention combat performance vary when using fleets of different ship classes and different loadouts, as measured by cost to purchase, cost to operate, and combat completion speed? If you're interested in the answer to that question, buckle up for information overload. First, a synopsis of the results from previous experiments. Fighters by themselves were incredibly efficient, but suffered from attrition over long periods. Relative to pure fighters, carriers plus fighters traded some raw power for more staying power, and were still very efficient. Destroyers struggled to stay alive long enough to get their guns on target, and the Asgard struggled to do anything. I didn't test very many medium ships because I didn't feel like it, and I didn't test very many missile loadouts because I didn't feel like that either. I will be testing both of those things this time. Since those previous experiments, we've seen the full release of 7.5, along with 7.6 and 8.0, which have brought about some huge changes to the player's experience in X4. The most relevant changes here are the ones associated with the new flight model and the propulsion rebalance, and I've heard a lot of people asking how much those changes have affected the AI. I could do a whole video on that question, but I'll oversimplify it here and just say that the flight model is not applied to AI-controlled ships in the same way that it's applied to the player. The player application aims to make flight paths curvier and driftier. The AI application makes flight paths curvier, but not driftier. That's explained on page 13 of the technical document that Egosoft released with version 7.5. Have fun getting through the first 12 pages. It is a humbling experience. Anyway, due to the asymmetrical application of the new flight model, all the associated changes also had asymmetrical effects, with the player being dramatically more heavily impacted than the AI. However, the cumulative effects of the three patches have still been noticeable enough for me to want to run this test again. Now, let's cover my methods. Like in previous versions, this experiment required fleets to destroy the two Xenon defense fleets patrolling Atia's Misfortune 1 and 3. These are the standard 1I, 2K, 30 escort fleets that are the most common serious military threat you'll face in X4. Unlike in previous versions, there's no station demolition. I replaced that section with a third enemy fleet, an H with a few escorts, to represent more minor engagements. Also, unlike in previous versions, the fleets don't have to escape from Atia's Misfortune, they just have to kill the three Xenon fleets. Another change is that I exclusively used simple commands, namely coordinate attack and position defense, to remove player skill from the equation as much as possible and leave all the tactical decision making to the AI. For the same reason, I also used relatively simple fleet structures. So, I've trimmed the fat and simplified the trials a little bit, and in exchange, I've included a wider variety of ships, fleets, and loadouts. I tested every major class of ship, many of them using multiple different loadouts, set up in a way that allows me to evaluate what these ships and loadouts bring to the table themselves in single-size class fleets, and what they contribute to hybrid fleets. I'll say that again. I've arranged these fleets in this way specifically for the purpose of gathering data on the ship classes within those fleets. Just because a fleet performs well here doesn't mean I recommend it for practical use. We'll go over my actual recommendations in the discussion section. Moving on with the methods, each of the 15 fleets I tested was scaled to multiple price points: 75, 150, and 225 million credits, as measured by the custom game creation price readouts. Those price readouts do not include the price of software or crew, which occasionally makes a small difference, and I factored that in. With each of the 15 fleets, the goal was to clear the test scenario 3 times in a row. I tried at the 75 million price point first, and if a fleet couldn't get 3 wins in a row there, I scaled it up to 150 million and tried again, and then again at the 225 million point if it still couldn't win. If the fleet managed to win 3 in a row at one of those price points, I measured the completion times, losses, and ammo expenditure for all 3 runs. I used those stats to generate a score between 0 and 100 to represent long-term performance, i.e. how quickly the fleet can complete a task and move on to the next one, and how much upkeep is required to keep the fleet operational over those multiple missions. So, we ended up with 2 metrics: short-term performance, measured by the investment required for the fleet to beat this single challenge, and long-term performance, measured by the score I just described. Those 2 metrics are the main data set I need to answer my experimental question, but I know the internet loves tier lists, so based on those metrics, I took it one step farther and broke the 15 fleets into 5 tiers: S, A, B, C, and D. There is no F tier because in X4 you can always just throw more money at a problem and you'll eventually win. The tiers aren't scientific at all, just a way to help us broadly categorize the fleets as we look at their performance. With that, at last, it's time for the results. I'm going to start with fleets that utilized only a single size of ship, then move on to the more diverse hybrid fleets, then finally conclude with what I'm calling exhibition fleets. I'll briefly describe the loadouts and setup for each fleet. To save time, let me just say that when it comes to the non-weapon portions of the loadouts, I generally started with an optimized mix of Commonwealth equipment, then if I had money left over, I upgraded to Terran shields, starting with the main shields, then the engine shields, then the turrets. The crews were also standardized. I gave fighters 2-star pilots and no crew, I gave battleships 4-star pilots and elite crews, and I gave everything else 3-star pilots and veteran crews. Now, let's look at the single-size fleets. I'm going to take this one size class at a time, in a random order to keep things interesting. First up is medium ships, which include the fleet that was the most fun and the most surprising out of the whole lineup. It's the one you've been watching in the background footage, and it's the one we'll start with. Its name is Front Toward Enemy, because it just fills an enormous volume of space with AoE damage. It is all Cobras, utilizing Tau accelerators, dumbfire launchers with scatter missiles, split flak turrets, and otherwise standard loadouts. I had low expectations for the medium ships going in, and at the 75 million price point this fleet did struggle, but at the 150 million price point it was like a switch was flipped. With 45 of these Cobras all blazing away at once, the fleet easily won 3 in a row with fast completion times, low losses, and only slightly excessive missile expenditure, earning it a spot in A tier. The other medium fleets were much more in line with my expectations. The next one is ramming speed, which was all katanas, which were already infamous for running into things at high velocity and actually got even less agile in 7.5. Nevertheless, they are a much beloved ship, and I wanted to give them a shot. The Proton Barrage is an incredible general-purpose weapon and is unique to Terran ships, so I used that, Argon flak turrets, and otherwise standard loadouts. Unfortunately, katanas are very expensive, and I could only afford 40 of them at the 225 million credit price point. Additionally, subcapitals attacking capitals under the new flight model have a new behavior that reminds me of World War II strafing runs, with long, slow, curving flight paths punctuated by very brief bursts of weapon fire. It's absolutely gorgeous to look at, but it's ludicrously inefficient. With ramming speed, the low number of ships plus low time on target meant the fleet just couldn't reliably take down capital ships, even at the 225 million price point, placing it in D tier. The last all-medium fleet is named Peace Corps because it's made up of ships from the two least warlike races in the X universe. As you might have guessed, this is the gunboat fleet, comprised of equal parts Teladi Peregrines and Boron Threshers. The Peregrines used pulse lasers and flak turrets for anti-fighter duty, and the Threshers used torpedoes for anti-capital duty, plus assorted Boron turrets. Threshers have good speed, good missile capacity, and only one weapon mount, which makes them a fairly optimized torpedo platform, but I quickly discovered you can't just have torpedo Threshers, so I added the old reliable Peregrine Vanguard to help out. Turns out the Pulse Peregrine is an absolute monster, and it probably could have done this without the Threshers, but I was committed to the Peace Corps fleet, which needed to be scaled up to 225 million credits to get critical mass of torpedoes. At that price point, it had moderate losses, expensive ammo consumption, and extremely fast completion times, landing it in B tier. The next size class we'll cover will be large ships. Up until recently, this pretty much just meant destroyers, so that's what we'll start with. We'll look at another all-Terran lineup. I summoned the full creativity of the Terran Protectorate and named this fleet Heavy Heatseeker Osakas. It consisted of all Osakas using tracking turrets with heavy Heatseeker missiles, alongside large beams, medium flak, and the usual mix of Commonwealth equipment. This is a very min-maxed defensive loadout, with the combination of good shields, a small and agile hull, the optimal tracking missile for stripping graviton turrets, and the Osaka's janky-ass hitbox that causes a lot of incoming fire to miss. The setup performed well enough, with 9 ships at the 225 million credit price point, with slightly worse than average attrition and completion times, giving it a spot in C tier. With the lower number of ships at lower price points, it just couldn't absorb incoming damage or disable targets quickly enough. You might get better performance out of something cheaper like Phoenixes. Still, for what it was, this fleet did fine. The next fleet is called Holy Water, a mix of the Paranid Odysseus and the Boron Ray in a 2-to-1 ratio, all with generally standard non-missile loadouts. The Rays are there for defense, distracting capitals and screening fighters with their ion net turrets. Meanwhile, the high DPS Odysseus backline is meant to engage after the Rays and hammer away from a distance at capital ships. That was the theory, anyway. The reality is that capital ship maneuvering is imprecise at best, and every fight had a chance to devolve into a bloody melee. However, when the fleet managed to fight from its optimal engagement range, it did very well. Main battery usage is the best I've seen it since 7.0. At the 225 million credit price point, Holy Water posted respectable completion times with wildly inconsistent losses that were moderate on average, earning it a slot in B tier. Last in the large-only category, we have a Hyperion test, which was requested by one of my viewers, Alborti Mango. There's actually a second Hyperion fleet that's closer to the composition they suggested, but I wanted to start with an all-Hyperion baseline, which brings us to the Hype Squad. These are what I consider to be standard Hyperion fits, the main feature of which is 2 dorsal tracking turrets with heavy heat-seeker missiles. Now, my regular viewers may recall that I took a hiatus from X4 for several months earlier this year. What I did not explain at that time was that I'd been trying to make a Hyperion test video, but the tests went so badly that when I reviewed the footage, I found that I had not said a single positive thing in over an hour of recording. That was the point at which I realized I needed to take a break. So I was hesitant to take on another Hyperion test, but I did it anyway, and nothing has changed. The Hyperion combines extreme fragility with stationary combat behavior, and the results are absolutely disastrous. Even at the 225 million credit price point, the Hype Squad never stood a chance, which puts it definitively in D tier. That brings us to the XL size class. X4 still only has one direct combat XL ship that can be mass produced, so the XL size class really just means the Asgard. I called this fleet the same thing I call all my Asgard fleets: big guns. I started with the same loadout I used in the previous tests, but that one can no longer kill fighters. I switched to a more beam-based loadout, but that one got rolled by capital ships. After a few more iterations, I ended up with half beams, half tracking turrets with heavy heat seekers, and that one finally managed to hold its own. It won 3 times at the 225 million price point, with very poor completion times and inconsistent loss rates. It had the single worst winning run out of the whole lineup, with a long-term performance score of 10 out of 100, but it also had the only run that didn't lose a single ship. Also, it actually fired the big laser with some degree of consistency, which was nice to see. Overall, its average performance over 3 runs placed it firmly in C tier. Last, but certainly not least, that brings us to the small ships. We'll start with Peer Review, so named because you can buy this entirely from the nerds at the Alliance of the Word Wharf. It is all Nodan Vanguards, with Mark II muon chargers, Mark II propulsion, and Mark III shields. Turns out the nerds know how to fight, because 170 of these Nodans cost less than 75 million and can easily win 3 times in a row with respectable speeds and low attrition costs, earning them a spot in the S tier. There's not much to say about this one. The Nodan offers great stats for its price, and so do muon chargers. The muons are a little janky under AI control, but still, 170 of these ships are an absolutely overwhelming force. They do take some losses, but since they're a single source loadout, they are incredibly easy to replace. Next up, we have what's probably my meanest fleet, in more ways than one. There's a guy on Reddit who loves to copy-paste some version of the phrase, "There's no such thing as imbalance in a single-player game." And so, in his honor, I assembled the most imbalanced fleet I could come up with and named it No Such Thing. This is an enormous number of dirt-cheap Nodans using Mark I TAL accelerators and other Mark I equipment, giving them a nasty set of stats for just 160 grand apiece. You can actually just spam these things and clear this scenario for well under 50 million credits, but since I had 75 million to play with, I decided to replace some of them with another vile abomination, the Blast Mortar She, with a mix of Mark II and Mark III equipment. The fleet ended up with 100 Nodans as the front line, super dangerous in their own right, but mostly there to clear the path for the 40 Shes to roll up and demolish the Xenon capital ships. There was no contest. This fleet won effortlessly at the 75 million price point, putting it at the apex of S tier. Last in the single-size fleets, we have my personal favorite general-purpose fighter loadout, the Chimera, with 4 Tau accelerators, 1 dumbfire launcher with scatter missiles, and a mix of Mark II and Mark III equipment. It's just a flying shotgun, very similar to the Cobras from Front Towards Enemy. This fleet is named Collateral Damage because in 7.5 it was very prone to friendly fire, but I actually didn't have that many friendly fire incidents here. The Chimeras kept things pretty tame and just flew around, casually obliterating everything with their high damage, high accuracy general purpose loadout. They did take some attritional losses over time, as unsupported Chimeras tend to do, but they still earned a spot in the S tier with fast speeds, manageable losses, and low ammo costs. That's all for the single-size fleets. So now we're moving on to the hybrid fleets, which all used at least 2 sizes of ship, always including at least 1 ship we've already used previously. I messed around with a bunch of hybrid fleets, but the 3 that made it into the final lineup ended up all using the shotgun Chimeras from the Collateral Damage fleet. I mentioned that those Chimeras have a bit of an attrition weakness when unsupported, so they're a great ship to pair up with some sort of repair service. We'll start with the simplest hybrid fleet, which I named Frenemies because it's a combination of Boron and Split ships. Specifically, it's a guppy that mostly stays out of combat and serves as a pure support ship for the shotgun Chimeras. It repairs them, rearms them, and allows them to utilize the position defense command without outside assistance. To afford the guppy, I had to shrink the Chimera wing by 12 ships, which is 20% of its strength at the 75 million credit price point. So the question here was whether the addition of the carrier's support services was worth the 20% loss in direct combat power. Turns out it was, as this fleet earned itself a spot in S tier, with slower completion times balanced by lower losses compared to the pure Chimeras. So, that was the pure support carrier. I also wanted a data point for the opposite end of the carrier spectrum, which brings us to a fleet called Ships Are Ammo. I designed this fleet to be as disadvantageous as possible for the carrier's fighters, balanced out by making the carrier itself relatively strong. This was a Raptor with shotgun Chimera subordinates, keeping them docked between engagements and deploying them with coordinate attack for each battle. I tried this with several different carriers at the 75 million credit price point. None of them succeeded, and the Raptor makes the most sense with a bigger budget, so that's the one I scaled up to the 150 million price point, where it did manage to clear 3 in a row and brawled its way into the B tier, although it was slow and had significant attrition, including the loss of the Raptor itself in one run. The third and final hybrid fleet is called the Purge, because it's made up of ships from the 2 factions most likely to go on a genocidal rampage, the Split Chimera and the Paranid Hyperion, using the same loadouts as before. I wanted to give the Hyperion another shot, and one of its selling points is that it can service a couple of fighters, so I gave it some nice, robust escorts. That said, I wanted the Hype to do most of the work instead of just being carried by the fighters, so I limited the escorts to 2 Chimeras per Hyperion. It still struggled, but the Chimeras were able to hold the Xenon back just barely enough for the Hyperion main batteries to do their work at the 225 million price point, which secured a C tier ranking for this fleet. Now, finally, that brings us to our long-awaited exhibition fleets. There are 2 of these. They were both viewer submissions, and although they're too different to really be interpreted alongside the other fleets, they both have unique features that I think are worth looking at just as individual data points. First, we have Rocket Science, submitted by Kajar. Among his many contributions to the X community, Kajar wrote all the wiki pages on missile weapons, so I wasn't surprised that he submitted an entirely missile-based fleet. We have the Sapporo forming the core of the fleet, the Irukandji skirmishing against subcapitals with tracking missiles, and the Prometheus as the heavy hitter with torpedoes. This isn't a complicated fleet. The goal is just to fire as many missiles as possible and see what happens. Turns out what happens is that this fleet inflicts massive casualties on both sides. The worst run had over 40 losses to friendly fire in less than 3 minutes. Then, the surviving escorts run out of ammo, leaving the Sapporos as the only combat-effective ships. At the 225 million credit price point, there were enough Sapporos left to finish the test, with high attrition and ludicrous ammo expenditure. However, the missiles didn't just hit friendlies. The Xenon died just as quickly, giving rocket science completion times just good enough to squeeze into the B tier. At long last, that brings us to the very final fleet, which is by far the weirdest one. This one was submitted by Rain on to Sunny Day. It is called Shybais, and it consists of railgun aspirators and missile rattlesnakes with no main batteries. The Asps have a mix of boson lances and mass drivers, the idea being that they fire staggered volleys to destroy and distract enemy escorts, clearing the way for the rattlesnakes to engage the Xenon capitals. The Rattlers should, theoretically, stay mobile and stay at long range, since their only anti-capital weapons are heavy dumbfire missiles. The theory here is really intriguing. However, there are some issues. Railguns are extremely expensive, they're still inaccurate, and even on paper their damage is pretty poor, so their applied DPS is pitifully low. Meanwhile, the rattlesnakes do attack from points outside graviton range, but they have no evasive pathfinding when moving between those points, so they'll happily fly directly into an eye's optimal firing arc. It's unfortunate. This fleet setup is really clever, but in practice it can't clear this scenario at any price point, leaving Shybais with a D tier ranking. That's all for the results. Now we'll dive into the discussion, where I'll analyze broad trends in the dataset, as well as other takeaways. First point, while that last fleet is still fresh in your minds, I just want to say, don't underestimate having NPC faction support. The viewer who submitted Shybais said it had performed well in Hatikva's Choice alongside the Argonne Defense Forces. I know it's easy to dismiss the NPC factions, but even as pure cannon fodder, they can really contribute a lot to the success of your fleets. Now, let's talk about trends in this dataset, starting with the very broad trend of decreasing cost effectiveness with increasing size class. It is dramatically cheaper to field a successful fighter fleet than it is to field a successful medium or capital fleet, and those dramatically cheaper fleets win faster and with fewer losses. Medium ships had variable performance but generally did better than destroyers, and destroyers did better than the Asgard. If we bring in the hybrid fleet results, we saw that if you take a capital fleet, remove some capital ships, and replace them with fighters, the fleet's performance improves. We also saw that carriers still do very well in a support role, trading some speed for lower attrition rates relative to pure fighters, but the value added by carriers decreases significantly if you deviate from that pure support role. So, in general, larger ships in direct combat roles are less cost-effective than smaller ships in direct combat roles in terms of both upfront cost and long-term performance, and in terms of both single-size performance and performance as components of hybrid fleets. Thinking back through the results, I can see several possible explanations. First, RNG and weight of numbers. Any ship at any time has a chance to do something catastrophically stupid. The fewer ships you have in your fleet, the more impactful those random single ship losses will be, so numerous cheap ships have an advantage. Second, weapon quality. Subcapital weapons are just straight up better than capital weapons. They have vastly superior damage, accuracy, and secondary effects. Capital ships can't even field anything competitive with a shard battery, let alone a blast mortar. No contest. Third, subcapitals are more maneuverable, and maneuverability has direct benefits for damage application, damage mitigation, deployment speed, and general battlefield mobility. And fourth, maneuverability has indirect effects on the responsiveness and adaptability of ships due to the nature of X4's AI. We refer to all non-player piloting as AI, but the reality is that most of the AI's actions are just scripted behaviors. The AI is only allowed to think when it begins a new behavior. It generally only begins a new behavior when it finishes the previous behavior. And finishing behaviors is generally tied to completing some sort of navigation. Add all that up, and the result is that more maneuverable ships have smarter and more adaptable AI than less maneuverable ones. That's a big advantage on its own, and it also circles back to my first point about RNG. Slower thinking AI is more likely to make catastrophic mistakes, so the RNG is doubly weighted against big, slow, dumb ships. There are certainly other factors at play here, but I am confident that the overall trend in cost effectiveness is mostly explained by the combined multiplicative effect of those four things: weight of numbers, weapon quality, direct effects of maneuverability, and interaction between maneuverability and AI responsiveness. Now that we've covered the general trend, let's talk exceptions, outliers, and secondary trends. The Hyperion is worse than the Asgard, despite being smaller. The issue is that the Hyperion uses AI behaviors that were primarily written for destroyers, which doesn't work at all because the Hype is built for evasion and destroyer AI does not evade. The Asgard uses the same behaviors and they're still not optimal, but the Asgard's design is closer to destroyers than the Hyperion is, which is why it performed very slightly better. Similarly, the Katana performed worse than the Osaka, despite being smaller, also for AI reasons. I mentioned earlier that subcapitals attacking capitals fly like atmospheric fighters on strafing runs. To be more specific, the new flight model's pathfinding uses curved paths called splines, and the splines are calculated so that the AI's nose is always pointed in its direction of motion. With the subcapital versus capital behavior, the subcapital will only fire its weapons during the portion of the spline where the nose is pointed at the target, meaning the portion where the direction of motion is directly towards the target. For ships with high speed and low agility like the Katana, that portion is very, very brief, leaving only a narrow window in which the ship can fire its guns. My test katanas were equipped with sustained DPS weapons rather than burst weapons, so they couldn't deal damage effectively in those narrow attack windows. The Chimera also has high speed and low agility, but it was equipped with burst weapons, so it did well, although I think it would do better with a second missile launcher for even more burst damage. Point being, the post 7.5 flight model favors burst weapons on fast, unmaneuverable ships, whereas sustained DPS weapons are better suited for ships that are slower or more maneuverable. Speaking of weapon systems, let's talk missiles. I was surprised to see that there wasn't a clear correlation between missile use and fleet performance. Out of all the missile-using fleets, only front toward enemy seemed to really outperform its counterparts because of missiles. All the other missile use just seemed as good as the alternatives, not better than the alternatives, when you factor in the price to rearm. I will have more diverse missile use in my upcoming faction fleets test, so stay tuned for that, but for now my takeaway is that missiles are generally worth the cost. Nothing more, nothing less. The one caveat there is that large groups of subcapital ships really like to get hit by their own tracking missiles and torpedoes, so if you're using those weapon systems, it might be worth investing in stronger shields. Speaking of which, my testing on scouts was unfortunately limited to just the single data point from rocket science, and because those all died to either friendly fire or capital ship explosions, it's hard to draw solid conclusions on scout performance. I will use more scouts in my faction fleets test, so once again, stay tuned for that. Now, this video is getting long already, so let me quickly cover 3 things: game version, your comments from the last video, and my personal fleet recommendations. Game version. I conducted this test in 8.0 Hotfix 1. I will not be repeating this test in later versions because the results were absolutely conclusive and they were absolutely consistent with my 7.1 test. To the extent the 2 tests were comparable, I found no differences in the relative performance of ship classes between the 2. There are obviously some micro-scale differences, like individual ship behaviors, but at the macro scale, there are no differences. Think about that. We've gotten a whole new flight model, a complete overhaul of the mathematics of X4 spaceflight, along with an overhaul of everything propulsion related, and we've ended up in exactly the same place in terms of game balance. That obviously isn't an accident. Egosoft is clearly aiming for this overall balance, and they're clearly being successful at it. So, yes, the Asgard and Sapporo got some behavior tweaks in 8.0 Hotfix 2, and yes, their fleets might inch up 1 notch on the totem pole as a result, and yes, that sort of thing might keep happening in future versions, but the overall trends are not going to change. Since we have consistency between this test and the last one, let's talk about your comments from the last test. Specifically, I want to look at your comments on why to use capital ships despite their relative inefficiency. First set of comments. Subcapitals take too much micromanagement, replacing them is too hard, and they die without dealing meaningful damage. None of those things are necessarily true, and in the context of this test, the opposite is true in all 3 cases. However, even if those comments weren't strictly accurate, the sentiment is that subcapitals are harder to use effectively than capitals, and that sentiment is accurate. For one thing, subcapitals have more equipment options in more price brackets, whereas capital equipment has a much narrower range of functionality and price, so there's more room to mess up with subcapital loadouts. Similarly, it's easier to lose fighters if you haven't set up your fleet correctly, simply because they're faster, which gives you less time to notice the issue and fix it before they all charge valiantly into a defense platform. So, to craft loadouts and fleets that perform at the level shown in this test, you do need a higher level of game knowledge for subcapitals than you do for capitals. Second set of comments. Destroyers have 0 attrition in trivial combat, like fending off small raiding parties, whereas occasionally you'll lose a fighter in those engagements. Yes, this is true, although those losses shouldn't be financially meaningful unless you're using inefficient loadouts or fleets. Third set of comments. It's easier to apply equipment modifications to capital ships, and they provide more raw stats per mod component. I'm not convinced the easier part is true, but the more stats part is definitely true. However, in order to test its practical effects, you'd have to assign some sort of value to mods, which is totally subjective. I do think that any non-zero value will favor larger ships to some extent, maybe even enough to move some of the capital ships up a tier, but there's no way to get more specific than that. Fourth set of comments. Personal piloting. If the player takes control of a capital ship, they can inflict more damage than if they take control of a subcapital ship. This is true, but it's another one that's impossible to quantify because everyone's skill level is different. Still, Because there were so many of these comments, I did test it, and here are the results at my individual skill level. This is an optimally modded Asgard under my control, an optimally modded Rattlesnake under my control, no such thing under AI control, and frenemies under AI control. The columns should be self-explanatory. How you interpret these results depends entirely on the value you assign to mods and the value you assign to your own time. I don't have a straightforward answer for you, so just pause the video and think it through. Speaking of things without straightforward answers, let's cover my fleet recommendations. If you were to just copy-paste a fleet from this test into your own game for practical use, I'd recommend either Frenemies or Holy Water. Those are the only two that cleared the scenario and can fight back-to-back campaigns non-stop, and do not require any additional player-owned infrastructure to support them. That said, again, all the test fleets were designed for data collection, not for practical use, so you obviously don't need to just copy-paste them wholesale. It probably makes more sense to just borrow the successful concepts, like the pure support position defense carrier concept from Frenemies, but you really don't even need to do that. This experiment is meant to provide information, not recommendations. I'd strongly advise you to take this information and use it your own way to improve your own fleets and loadouts. And it doesn't stop here, because I have more tests on the way. This was my high-attention ship-to-ship combat test looking at variation between ship sizes, classes, and loadouts. There's still plenty more to test, including low attention, differences between factions, and much, much more. Hopefully, by the time I finish, you'll have all the information you need to build cost-effective fleets that fit your individual playstyle. So, stay tuned. That's all for now. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you'll tune in next time, and until then, this is Captain Snuggles, signing off.